This is the 217 Recovery Podcast with Corey Winfield.
All right.
13th of October, 2020. My name is Corey Winfield, and this is the 217 Recovery Podcast. On the show today, a very special guest, and came in contact with her just very recently. I was studying eating disorders in my psychology class, and it really started to hit home, like how similar eating disorders and substance use are, and the recovery from both of them. So Chelsea Kronengold from the National Eating Disorders Association is on the line. Chelsea, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on such short notice, and I really do appreciate it. And we kind of touched base a little bit before the podcast started, and just kind of giving you a background, because you're probably like, why is this dude who used to drink a lot reaching out to me, about eating disorders? And, I kind of explained it to you, and I doubt that that's what you were thinking, but I just kind of wanted to kind of touch base and just say, hey, yeah, because I was watching a video, and it was of a man, and I believe he was in England, and he pointed out that a lot of gay men have eating disorders, which I was not aware of. And there's a lot of things I wasn't aware of, but he was going on to say that. And they went to like a meeting, which I recognized kind of like, hey, that's almost like an AA meeting, what they're doing there. And the guy that was speaking was talking about recovery and just using words. And it sounded like me word for word when I'm talking to newcomers into, the recovery from substance use. And if you could give me a little background on who you are, what you do, and maybe touch base with some of those questions that I had just a second ago and prior to starting the podcast.
Sure. Well, first of all, it makes a lot of sense that you reached out because, to your point, there is a lot of overlap and similarities between substance abuse and eating disorders. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you today, and I hope that your listeners take away something from this talk. So my name is Chelsea Kronengold, and I am the communications manager for the National Eating Disorders Association, or NEDA. And I've been involved with the organization since 2012 after or during my own personal struggle with binge eating disorder. And I've bounced around in a bunch of different departments. I have my master's degree in clinical psychology. So I do our social media and communications, but I also have the academic background as well. So hopefully what I'm saying has some validity to it.
So you had a problem too, the binge eating disorder.
Yes, and substance abuse does run in my family. So again, a lot of similarities. But so in terms of I guess I'm going to kind of go down the line. So one of the first things you mentioned was that you learned that gay men have higher risks with eating disorders. And that's true. However, all men, all people, all genders, ages, races, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, abilities, etc., all people are at risk of developing an eating disorder. So historically, we always thought of it to be an illness that affects just young, white, thin girls. And we know that's not true. But there's so much misconceptions and misunderstanding and stigma that is surrounded by eating disorders that, men are often left out of the conversation. And when they are mentioned, it usually does focus on the LGBTQ population, but that's not always the case. So that was one of the points I wanted to touch on. I don't know if you want to talk about it or if you want me to go into some of the other points of some things you were mentioning in your intro.
We can go into some other things.
Okay. So another thing that I thought was really interesting that you brought up was the meeting that you saw in this video, and that it reminded you a lot of an AA meeting. And there actually is something called EDA, so Eating Disorders Anonymous, that follows the big book, and it has, I think it has its own version of it, but it's set up very similarly. And so it is, in fact, exactly like AA. So there are those opportunities. And likewise, recovery is a word that we use all the time when it comes to eating disorders. And that is what happens when you work hard and you get through this problem you have, just like substance abuse, and you come out the other side. You're either recovered or in recovery, depending on how you choose to view that, which is, again, I think people with substance abuse issues would also, think that they're either or define themselves as in recovery or recovered, just depending on what they feel more comfortable with as well.
So even though, because a lot of times we just say we're in recovery because we're kind of taught to, oh, well, you're, one drink away, and I am, and I mentioned that earlier too. So would you say you're in recovery from like an eating disorder, or just in recovery in general, or like?
I'm not sure if I mentioned this once the podcast started recording, but we were talking before we started, and I disclosed to you that I guess I did just say that, and that's why I got involved with NEDA, because of my personal experience. So yes, I personally choose the term in recovery because I also feel that recovery is this ongoing process, and sometimes there might be slips and lapses. And so it's just an ongoing thing. However, there are some people with eating disorders, and again, I would assume with substances, that they feel that their recovery is definite, and that's awesome, and that is more helpful for them than thinking of it as a process, that they just, they had an eating disorder, they no longer have one, and that's it. And so other people might find comfort in that word.
And there's different types of eating disorders as well. And now that you mentioned, the AA stuff, or the EDA, I do remember seeing at a club that I go to in Charlevoix, they had on the schedule overeaters.
Yep.
And
which is different.
Yeah, I was like, oh, okay, it must be like Weight Watchers, but you're right. I doubt it's like Weight Watchers, but it's different than having the binge eating disorder. It's different than being anorexic. Those are three different things, really. And do you want to maybe touch on those and maybe some signs, or like how does someone notice? Because with me being an alcoholic, it was very easy to spot the signs, but again, people coming up to me, like family members going, Corey, you need to get help. That stuff didn't work. Like, so I'm sure it's the same. Reaching out to somebody, it's probably embarrassing. Like if somebody who's suffering from eating disorder is approached the wrong way, it could cause major problems. I would assume.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, again, another example of that similarity between eating disorders and substance abuse. And I should preface it by saying that a lot of the professionals that treat eating disorders are also qualified and often do treat substance abuse as well. And a lot of treatment centers for eating disorders have a substance abuse track as part of it, because there is so much commonality and comorbidity between the two. So a lot of the triggers, a lot of that stuff is going to be the same, because eating disorders they're a mental illness. And yes, there's that physical manifestation often, and the symptoms, people cope with the emotions by using food, whether it's restricting food, binging food, binge purge, but it's not really about the food. It's about what's going on internally. And so just like if you go for a drink, it's not really because of the alcohol. It's a way of coping and numbing out what's going on internally. So yes, so there's a lot of overlap in the triggers. So exactly like you're saying, like what to say, what not to say. Someone could potentially say something that would further trigger someone. So I'm not sure what advice you would give to somebody that's speaking out about or trying to, confide in someone that they're struggling with substances. But with eating disorders, which again, I'm sure it's similar, it's just about if you're on the receiving end and somebody's telling you what's going on, listen with compassion, listen without judgment, and same thing where really people seek help for their eating disorders, or they really want to get out of it when they want to. So a family member might be concerned about your eating disorder, but if you're not motivated to change, nobody can force you to change. So, so sometimes it really depends on the person's readiness to start the recovery process.
So when they eat dinner and man, they eat like a ton, and you realize that every time you eat with them, they immediately excuse themselves and go to the bathroom. And that doesn't necessarily mean, hey, they have a problem. But when you look at them and go, they look normal, they have a normal body weight, and they're eating twice as much as you, there's some red flags, but I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's just like, where's my place? I know it's not healthy, but there's some serious physical damage that is happening in the body when people do that. And you might look at them on the outside and go, oh yeah, well, they're nice and fit and, or they might be a few pounds overweight, but it looks better than, being 800 pounds, but it's still doing a lot of damage to the body. It affects the kidneys and the liver, correct?
Yeah, so there's definitely physical consequences of eating disorders. And again, this is something that the media doesn't necessarily portray, so people kind of have a hard time understanding. But you actually can't tell if someone has an eating disorder by looking at them or what type of eating disorder. So there are people that have anorexia that are in higher weight bodies, and that's called atypical anorexia because they have they meet all the criteria for anorexia except the BMI component of it. And those people often feel stigmatized and misunderstood because a lot of the anorexia treatment does focus on the weight when that's not all it is. And same with binge eating or bulimia. You could have somebody that's in a smaller body, normal weight, as you said, or in a higher weight body. And so, yes, often people with anorexia are in smaller bodies and people with binge eating disorder are in larger bodies. That generally tends to be what happens, but not always.
And
but there are.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that. No, I was just going to say that there are, for each of the disorders, there's different health consequences, physically and otherwise. And so, for example, you're talking about the person who eats a lot at dinner, which maybe isn't a concern, but then the fact that they get up to go to the bathroom after every time, that's definitely a red flag. And I forgot where I was going with this, but so that their weight might not be the physical consequence, but the purging could cause, cardiac failure or troubles. Your electrolytes are imbalanced. So those are really the symptoms and the consequences that we at NEDA are more concerned about than the actual fluctuation in weight.
And if somebody, so for someone in Michigan, because you're in New York, right? Well, that's where you guys are based out of, or?
Yeah, our headquarters is in New York. I recently relocated to Florida, but we're New York based for the most part. But we're a national organization. Yeah.
So, but you probably run into different insurance problems, I would assume, through different states or different companies. But if you're on, I'm trying to look at this as like, I'm trying to compare it to like, okay, if someone has a drink problem, someone has a problem with meth or heroin, opiates, and that they want help and they have insurance, they can call their insurance, they can talk to their doctor and say, hey, look, I need to go to treatment. And that can be done if they're on Medicaid. Here in Michigan, they can call whatever region they're in, and they'll talk with their organization. Like for us in Northern Michigan, it's NMRE. Southwest Michigan, it's SWIMBA, and then